I'm delighted to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Kristin Mann, who, as I'm discovering over the course of this semester, as we kind of get to grips with what everybody does in the department, Kristin does an excellent job in our secondary education program and training teachers through the history department, which has a program for the licensure of teachers. And Kristin has done a wonderful job with the teachers and has done a lot of work through them, including an exhibit on Mifflin Worcester Gibbs, which has been lauded throughout the city. Tonight, Kristin turns to something more close to home in her interest in Latin American history and continues a sort of mini-series following on from Dean Baldwin on modern Mexico and Latin America, which of course has been in the news because of the centenary of independence and the revolution. Dr. Mann's latest book came out not very long ago, in fact just this year, on the power of song, music and dance in the mission communities of northern New Spain, which was published with Stanford University Press. And tonight her subject encompasses the broader field of Latin America with her topic. Dr. Mann's title is Viva la Independencia, Mexican Independence and Public Memory, 1810 to 2010. Dr. Mann.
Mexican independence began in 1810 and ended in 1821 and has been commemorated in the 200 years since 1810. And as with many commemorations of civic festivals, many leaders in Mexico and in the Mexican American community in the United States have looked to celebrations of independence to demonstrate their vision of what Mexico was and what it could become. And also commemorations of Mexican independence shaped Mexican identity, and the leaders sought to shape Mexican identity through the Fiestas Patrias. These are the festivities of the homeland, basically, for Independence Day. In the United States, Mexican Americans seized upon what some historians have called interactive spaces of these patriotic festivals to reshape their own identities as Mexicans and Americans, and to redirect their energies towards community building projects, and to demonstrate to the Anglo community that they had become a political force to become reckoned with. So that's what we're going to look at today. That's kind of the point of what I'd like to show you over the next few minutes here, is how these celebrations really served to define Mexican history and identity. And they were tools both used by the government and the administration to try to shape what Mexican history meant and what independence meant. But also they create these little spaces for other groups to have a voice in the way that they viewed Mexican history and identity. So let me give you an overview of Mexican independence, which is a little bit difficult. I could spend the entire time talking about how Mexican independence happened because it's kind of complicated. But basically in 1810, a renegade priest named Miguel Hidalgo, and he was fairly renegade. He was charged by the Inquisition and actually convicted and excommunicated by the church. He had several children by a woman that he wasn't married to. Wasn't supposed to have the children or the marriage. He participated in salons along the French model, reading Enlightenment thinkers and discussing with a lot of wealthy Creoles and businessmen in northern Mexico, where the silver money was really strong. He was interested in all of these ideas, but Hidalgo was a little bit more radical than your average Creole intellectual in that he really believed in equality. He wanted to free slaves immediately. He wanted people of not all genders, but of all races, and Mexico was filled with lots of different combinations of racial elements, to be able to be citizens and vote in Mexico. So he and some other wealthy Creole elites, some other priests in northern Mexico, were interested in rebelling against Spain while Spain was in the throes of the Napoleonic Wars. And they had a conspiracy going, but they were discovered by the local royal authorities. And so as a preemptive strike against being rounded up, Hidalgo goes to the church and he issues his famous grito, which is now what has been commemorated for the last 200 years. And this grito, the scream of independence, we have 3 primary source accounts of it, all written after the fact, so it's sort of selective memory. And they all contain things like Viva la Independencia, Viva America, not Viva Mexico, because Mexico didn't exist. It was just, Mexico was the city. Muera el mal gobierno, which is death to bad government, and mueran los gauchupines. And the gauchupines, they're spur wearers, which meant the peninsular Spaniards, the royalists who had all of the jobs and the power and the authority in colonial Mexico. And so they don't say death to the king, they say death to bad government. So these guys, they didn't really have a huge problem with the king. Hidalgo was not crazy about the idea of a king, but many of the Creole elites didn't have a problem with the king. They were really interested in having a local voice in the government. So he kicks off independence by calling his parishioners together to prevent them being found up and arrested before they had a chance to launch this independence movement. And eventually, within the next few weeks, they win some battles. They round up and imprison some very wealthy Spaniards in the region, and they kill them. Before too long, Hidalgo's masses are up to 80,000 individuals, and it's scaring the heck out of people like Allende, who were allied with Hidalgo to begin with, but they really didn't envision all of these mestizo and mulatto and indigenous people following Hidalgo, who was talking about equality for everybody and getting rid of slavery and some of these things that some of the others felt like were going too far. What Allende and some of the others agreed with was that Americanos, Americans, that is, people of the Americas, ought to have more power and influence and be equal to peninsular Spaniards in the administration of the colony. So not so different, radically different from what had happened in the United States earlier. What scared everybody was the violence that surrounded Hidalgo and his masses. And eventually, Hidalgo and his followers have to retreat further north. They get very close to Mexico City, but they're stopped at a mountain pass, and they have to go back further north. They fall into a trap. Hidalgo and Allende are both captured and executed by firing squad. And then Hidalgo's head is hung in a cage for 10 to 13 years on a hook outside the main plaza of the city in which he first issued his grito as a warning to not mess with the royal authorities. So it's kind of a scary thing. I put Hidalgo's banner there on the right because some of the accounts also say that Hidalgo said, "Long live Our Lady of Guadalupe," who was the Virgin Mary's image that was preferred by Creoles and especially mestizo and indigenous Mexicans at that time, because she's a dark-skinned image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, who had appeared, the legend went, to a native person, Juan Diego, who's since been canonized by the church, interestingly enough. We don't know that he existed, but he's canonized. And so this was the Virgin that Hidalgo favored. And he put her on his banner, and so he was very much still excommunicated by the church, but Catholicism is important in his movement and the people who followed him. After Hidalgo and Allende are killed, Jose Maria Morelos picks up the struggle in the southern part of Mexico, And he's able to gather delegates to a convention in 1814 and 1815 that meet, and they write a document that's known today as Sentiments of the Nation. It's very similar to the Declaration of Independence or the Declaration of Rights of Man from the French Revolution, and it outlines some key principles of government that these revolutionaries were envisioning for Mexico, including the abolition of slavery, and the setting aside of two holidays, one, September 16th, to honor the anniversary of Hidalgo's call to arms, and the other, Our Lady of Guadalupe's feast day. There's some really interesting personalities who are also involved in that Congress at Chilpancingo in the south of Mexico. But Morelos eventually gets captured in Oaxaca in the Sierra, and he doesn't make it to Mexico City with his army either. Vicente Guerrero, and all of these people, you might recognize their name if you know Mexican geography, because they all have states named after them in Mexico. He picks up the independence charge between 1818 and 1821. But eventually, Mexican independence is achieved by a very unlikely man who had fought against Morelos and Hidalgo. And his name was Iturbide, Augustine Iturbide, and he had fought with the royalist forces. But by 1821, he's just not feeling that loyal to the Spanish crown. In South America, for example, Venezuela, Simon Bolivar had been very busy in South America, declaring independence all over the place, and Jose de San Martin. And so it was time for Mexico to conclude these long wars of independence. Iturbide manages to convince all the troops under his charge to switch sides, basically, if they agree to the conditions that he is going to propose to Guerrero. And the conditions, known as the Plan de Iguala, are three guarantees. First of all, separation from Spain. Second of all, loyalty to the Catholic Church. And third of all, equality and citizenship for all. But the conservative element in all of this was that the new government was going to be offered to either the King of Spain, should he choose to get up, go across the Atlantic, and live in Mexico to rule, which actually wasn't as far-fetched as it seemed, because that's what the King of Portugal had done. He moved to Brazil and ruled Portugal from Brazil for a while Napoleon was in Portugal. So they're going to offer it to Fernando first, and if he doesn't want it, they'll offer it to one of his brothers or cousins or some other royal prince from Europe to come over and govern Mexico. And Guerrero wasn't very happy about this, but he was happy about the idea of being able to lay down his arms, and so he agrees to this, and in 1821, on September 27th, Mexico gets its independence. And there's the Plan de Iguala on the right, and on the left you can see a map of Mexico at independence, which looks quite different from the Mexico of today because it includes all of Texas and the western United States as well. Central America also follows suit very quickly after Mexico declares its independence, and there's not even a single battle fought in Central America, and they gain their independence as well. So there are a lot of problems with commemorating this holiday and the independence movement in general. And commemorations in general are used to inculcate norms and values of society by repeating certain behaviors and repeating certain ceremonies, like the Grito de Dolores, the scream for independence. And this is supposed to establish continuity by leaders with the past, right? We're going to remember our past in a certain way, and it's going to help shape the way that we think about our present and our future. And who we include in the telling of the story and who we highlight in the telling of the story tells us a lot about what we value as a society. But commemorations of Mexican independence were particularly difficult because independence didn't lead to a new empire with a brand new constitution. Mexico didn't have a constitution that was solid and stayed in line for more than a very small period of time until 1857. So there's not a new constitution to celebrate. Race and class issues in Mexico were extremely complicated by the amount of racial mixture that had happened during the colonial period, and it wasn't entirely clear at independence whether that third guarantee, which was equality and citizenship for all, to whom that was going to be applied. And it just differed based on who was in power. And there were a lot of power shifts in Mexico between 1821 and 1876. Also, priests had led the initial movements. Both Morelos and Hidalgo were priests. However, in the 19th century, the early 19th century, when we start commemorating this holiday, the church ran into problems because the church was allied with the conservative strain of politics. But the conservatives did not particularly like Hidalgo and Morelos. Hidalgo was much too radical for them. You know, he had called for equality, and the conservatives were not interested in equality. They liked their hierarchy just fine, thank you very much. So there's the problem of who do we celebrate? We'd like to emphasize the role of the Catholic Church, but we have to be really careful about overemphasizing Hidalgo and Morelos because they're too radical. And what do you do about Our Lady of Guadalupe? If she's a symbol for independence, what else does she mean? Can it be too radical? And the other thing was that of the sites involved in independence, it was spread all throughout Mexico. But Mexico City, the capital city, was probably the least involved of any city in the independence movement. And it had been the capital during the colonial period, and it was the capital in the new national period. So to try to build a story and build a commemoration centered in Mexico City when much of the action of independence had happened elsewhere was going to prove to be very difficult, especially when your major actors in the story didn't really agree with the kind of government that went into place right at independence. So what we have in the early 19th century then, you can go ahead and switch to the next, is competing versions of the independence story. And they're really typified very well by this painting. On the left, you see Miguel Hidalgo, and on the right, you see Agustin Iturbide. And by the way, that story happens, Iturbide, they're not able to find a prince from Europe to come over and govern Mexico. So guess what? Iturbide makes himself the prince from Europe. And he crowns himself Emperor Augustine I of Mexico. And that lasts for about 6 months before, that's not so cool anymore. Mexicans first start celebrating independence, the anniversary of 1810, in 1814, 1815, with that Declaration of Sentiments, which named it as a national holiday. But Iturbide, who lasted, he lasted about 10 months. The celebration that Iturbide preferred was September 27th, which was the date that the Plan de Iguala had been agreed upon and the date on which troops entered Mexico City and proclaimed Mexico an empire. So which holiday were we going to celebrate? Well, it depended on whether a conservative or a liberal was in power, and those powers shifted in the 1830s and the 1840s. What did stay the same, regardless of whether the 27th or the 15th, 16th was celebrated, was that remains of independence heroes were brought to the capital city to be buried there. And that was a very symbolic event, that you're bringing in people from the hinterlands of Mexico, and you're centering them, connecting them to the capital of the new nation in Mexico City. Another thing that happened between 1821 and 1828 was a symbolic manumission of slaves on either the 16th or the 27th, depending on which one was celebrated. And that was until 1828 when slavery was officially abolished in Mexico. During the 1820s, the custom of creating juntas patrióticas to finance and arrange festivities at the national and local levels was begun, and they were funded mostly by private donations. Any extra left over after the celebrations were finished went to orphanages and, in particular, widows and children of men who had been killed in the independence struggle. But there was also conservative character to many of the celebrations in the 1830s and 40s, including banning the sale of alcohol, many references to Iturbide and paintings of him here in his full military garb. And indigenous villages continued to stage their own celebrations, which happened to mostly be on September 15th, which was the night actually before the night that Grito de Dolores was issued. So we have dueling holidays until the 1840s. And an example of this also you can see in the images of Mary that were part of these celebrations. So Our Lady of Guadalupe matched with September 16th, and Our Lady of Remedios, who was the image of Mary preferred by the Spaniards because she had supposedly aided Cortez in conquering the Aztecs. She was the favored virgin that was celebrated in context with September 27th. In 1843, a conservative speech on September 27th lauded the Army of the Three Guarantees, and it says that this army, which was Iturbide's army, brought this nation to life and gave it a well-deserved opportunity to associate with the great civilized countries of the world. Remembrance of September 27th is a remembrance of liberty, as pure as the innocent dreams of a Vestal Virgin, as rich and fruitful as the land itself upon which the blessings of liberty are bestowed. The rest of the speech, which is fascinating to read, compares Iturbide to the Star of Bethlehem, who guided the Mexican people to independence. And again, this was a conservative speech. And this is in 1843, right before war with the United States breaks out and right after Texas has been lost. And the army, which was also very closely associated with the conservative movement in Mexico, the army figures prominently in this speech, and there are references and analogies to the Army of the Three Guarantees and the Mexican National Army, which had fought so bravely in Tampico, in Texas, and in Veracruz, three fairly large wars that had taken place in the 1830s and 1840s since Mexico had achieved its independence. The other national holidays that were celebrated during this period were the anniversary of the Plan de Iguala's proclamation, which was in February, and the anniversary of the Oath of Allegiance to the Plan de Iguala, which was in March. And these national holidays were celebrated with volleys of artillery fire, masses of thanksgiving, again, the church's connection to the conservative movement, and receiving lines in which the relevant authorities met with local people, kind of in the guise of, Andrew Jackson opening up the White House and shaking hands with people. The conservatives would go out and shake hands. However, in 1857, a new liberal constitution was completed, and Mexico entered a period of liberal rule, and the most notable figure in this movement was Benito Juarez, who is today probably the most celebrated figure in Mexican history. Juarez is really notable because he was a full-blooded Indian, and he is elected to office in 1857 in Mexico. The United States has still not elected a full-blooded Indian. There's one in Congress, but that's about it. So celebrations in the 1850s and then in the 1860s, except during this brief period of French occupation, demonstrated efforts to try to bring Mexico together as a nation, national unity. And again, if you correspond this, so Mexico gets its independence in 1821, and then we see the rise of Mexican nationalism really identifying as a nation by the late 1850s. So that's 35 years later, and you compare it to the United States, you see a similar trend happen. We have 1776 with the Declaration of Independence, and really U.S. nationalism building around the War of 1812. This is a similar time period as the United States. But these celebrations you can really see trying to bring the nation together. They emphasize the multitude of Mexican heroes of all races and classes. One speech from Tixtla, this was in southern Mexico where Guerrero and Morelos had been strong in 1857 on September 16th, now celebrated as Independence Day. The divine sun of 1810 reappears every year on September 16th to disperse the shadowy clouds that darken our political horizons. Let the sons of Mexico, their heads once bowed in misfortune and hopelessness, proudly raise their faces to the light. And another reason for trying to really build Mexican nationalism around this holiday in the 1850s was that, of course, Mexico had lost to the United States a very sizable amount, half of its national territory. And so there's an attempt to try to rally Mexican pride in the face of these misfortunes. The Declaration of Independence, which was the Declaration of Sentiments from that Chilpancingo Conference in 1814, was read at these celebrations. It was not the Plan de Iguala. And the Thanksgiving Mass, which had been prominent in the 1830s and 40s, was missing from these celebrations, and they took a much more secular tone, and that's in keeping with the liberals who attacked the church and church privilege. Also in this period, statues began to appear to Mexican national heroes along the Paseo de la Reforma, which is the main avenue in Mexico City, and they were dedicated on Independence Day. Ironically, the first statue dedicated was to the Spanish King Carlos IV. And then the second one was actually to Columbus. Then we have a period of the French intervention when Maximilian, who is related to Napoleon III, is invited by the conservatives to come to Mexico to rule over Mexico. This is that prince they had been looking for since 1821. And the problem was that Maximilian was actually a liberal. So when the conservatives get him to Mexico and they figure out that he really likes the idea of equality and full voting rights, and his ideas are really quite liberal, they're not happy with him. And of course the liberals were not happy with him at all because he was a European prince and they wanted to be self-governing. So he was caught between a rock and a hard place, and he eventually loses his life over it. But he was the first to travel to Dolores, the city where Hidalgo had issued the grito, and in 1864 he commemorates that occasion by repeating that speech from the same church that Hidalgo had made the speech. He took September 27th off the calendar of Mexican national holidays. He made a visit to Hidalgo's home, and he set aside the home as a national museum. And it was ironic that he believed in liberal ideas, but was brought to Mexico by the conservatives, and the liberals fought against him. In 1866, Maximilian is at the end of his tenure in Mexico, but brass bands played for an assembled crowd of 30 to 40,000 people in the Zocalo in Mexico City, and there was a military parade from the Plaza de Armas to the cathedral, and a procession from the palace to the cathedral, and a service of Te Deum Laudamus afterwards, a Thanksgiving service. All the theaters were chartered by the government and thrown open to the public. At 3:30, a bullfight came off, which was free to everyone. And the festivities were terminated by a pyrotechnical display on the Great Plaza at 8, which was witnessed by about 50,000 people, this evening fireworks spectacular. Alas, Maximilian is killed. In 1869, we have a really interesting event where the first national railroad, the first branch of that railroad, was completed between Mexico City and Puebla, which was the other big city. And so the procession took place on the train instead of within the city of Mexico City. And again, you can see efforts to bring the country together through the railroad line reflected in this celebration. A Mexican musician, composed and performed a song called La Locomotiva, which was all about the train, and it apparently brought down the house, and there were even requests for that in the United States at the ball, and afterwards it was performed across Mexico. So at this, in this service, music wasn't just part of the church, and it wasn't just part of a military parade, but music was something that the audience could enjoy and participate fully in, and this reflects Juarez's wish for a more democratic Mexico. The next. Okay, so then we get to the big Porfirian era, which goes from 1876 to 1910. And Porfirio Diaz, Deborah talked about him last time. He is a liberal, but he manages to keep getting himself reelected, and he becomes more associated with the conservatives by the end of his period because he has really encouraged business investment. He's very friendly with the United States, and he has kind of squashed the rights of the indigenous peoples, even though he said that he was going to improve them. But he ruled a long time, so he had a lot to be criticized about. September 15th was also his birthday. So he celebrated September 15th. The festivities were as large on September 15th as they were on September 16th. And during the Porfiriato is really when this turned into a nighttime celebration the night before Independence Day. There were balls, fiestas, bells, artillery fire, speeches. The expansion of the railroad track across Mexico made this a tourist event for the first time. More than 20,000 people from outside of Mexico City attended in 1883. Different social groups held balls in different parts of the city. And an interesting thing that happened during this period was a controversy over the bell that Hidalgo rang. So in 1886, Diaz and the City Council of Mexico appointed a commission to go to Dolores and find the bell that Hidalgo had rung and bring it back to Mexico City, because that bell was a relic of the independence struggle and belonged in the capital city. So they go up to Dolores, and of course the people in Dolores tell them, well, that bell doesn't exist anymore. It's been melted down. It disappeared a long time ago. But of course, the bells that were in the bell tower were mostly the same bells that had been there when Hidalgo rung them. It's just that the people of Dolores didn't want to give up their bell. So they go back to Mexico City empty-handed and have use the replica bell that they've been using for a while. And in 1896, the story got back that that bell was still in Dolores. So another commission of inquiry is appointed, and they go up to Dolores and they try to find the bell. And they do take a bell out of the bell tower and bring it back to Mexico City. But today, if you go to Dolores Hidalgo, they'll still tell you they have the bell. And Guanajuato also claims to have the bell. And Mexico City claims to have the bell. So it's just sort of this fight over who owns independence. And the fact that the bell becomes so important is also probably tied to the Liberty Bell in the United States. Because while the bell was a part of it, church bells were used to ring notices of all kinds of events in colonial Mexico, and were still used to communicate ideas in the 19th century. And so it was really, more about things other than the bell, although things began to center on that bell. In 1886, also, in that monument, the monuments on Paseo de la Reforma, a statue to Cuauhtémoc, who is the last Aztec emperor, is also inaugurated. And this fits in with Diaz's first articulation of this principle of indigenismo. But indigenismo meant what it meant in the United States at that time, which was this idea of a noble savage. We're gonna mythify our indigenous past to say that these people, they don't need to have rights now, they need to be more like us, but they are noble savages to be put on display. They're somewhat exotic. It's the same time in the United States that the Buffalo Bill Cody Wild West shows are going on, and so it's the same spirit that this statue is dedicated. In the 1894, there's an interesting article that appeared in the Mexican press called "To Whom Do We Owe the Fatherland?" And his answer, Francisco Cosmes, was Cortez. He said, Hidalgo is not the father of Mexico, Cortez is the father of Mexico. Mexico didn't owe anything to the Aztecs, didn't descend from them, but was completely Spanish. This did not really jive with what Diaz had been promoting in Mexico. He saw, basically, he was using this social Darwinism model, evolution of Darwinism, to see evolution from Cuauhtémoc to the modern Mexican citizen. And you can also see this in the exhibits about Mexico at the world's fairs around the world in the late 19th century, which also have exhibits that talk about the history of Mexico. And all of these exhibits have texts that talk about the Mexican independence struggle. And they do include Hidalgo, but also Iturbide. All right. So We arrive at the centennial celebration in 1910, and I could again spend the entire time talking about this one, so I won't. But you can see here, it's very clear that Mexico City is going to be the center of the nation. This is right on the eve of revolution, so there's a lot of discontent around Mexico. But Diaz poured a lot of money into the celebration of the centennial. And it was to show off Mexico City to the world. The Mexico City business community actually attempted to get the World's Fair to Mexico City in 1910, but the world community was not so sure about having something in Mexico City. And so this was kind of like the, so what? Look at what a big party we can put on to the World's Fair people as well. So electrifying Mexico City was a big part of the gear up for the centennial celebration, and you can see that here. There were huge centenario parades, two big ones, the Gran Procesión Cívica, and this one was a procession of all the different groups and elements of Mexican society, everybody from the labor movement to the government officials to the cofradías from specific churches were involved in that procession. There were probably more people in the procession than there were watching the procession. And then the next slide, which is of the Gran Desfile Histórico, and this is half pageant, half parade. It had three major components, and they each portrayed major eras in Mexican history. The first one was the Spanish conquest. So of course we're not portraying the indigenous past, just the Spanish conquest. And the scene portrayed on the moving float was of Montezuma meeting Cortez. So it's the great meeting of the races, which was again how Diaz was envisioning history. The second scene was the Spanish colonial period, and the third scene that they chose to represent was the entrance of the Army of the Three Guarantees into Mexico City. It was not the Grito de Dolores. As part of that third scene, there was one float dedicated to Hidalgo, and it's the one on the left here, and that is his granddaughter that is standing in the middle, who was riding on the float. And on the right, you can see the guy playing Montezuma, who was entering to meet Cortez. And so they really had outfitted, you can see the capes that were beaded spectacularly for these indigenous peoples who were representing the Indians. And there was really, there's stuff in the literature about making sure you get authentic looking Indians to portray the Indians in the parade, that they're not mestizos. They can't be light-skinned. But for the Gauchapines, who they're fighting against in the Army of Three Guarantees, they've got to be really, really light-skinned so that they look Spanish. More than 50,000 people witnessed this spectacle. And on the night of September 15th, Diaz rang the bell of independence at the Zócalo. But of course, the year afterwards, he's out of power and the revolution has begun. So we'll go to the next slide. So during the revolution, I mean, compare this to the slide that you saw before. You know, independence is celebrated, but they are smaller, very regional celebrations that involve very small local parades and a recreation of the Grito. In 1913, along the U.S.-Mexican border, U.S. troops actually pulled down Mexican flags that were raised in the United States on September 16th to commemorate Independence Day, indicating that tensions between the U.S. and Mexico were pretty strong at that point. The 1917 celebration in Mexico City included aero acrobatics for the first time, demonstrating this new technology of war, which was indeed used during the Mexican Revolution. And in 1921, commemorative coins were issued that honored revolutionary heroes. You can go on to the next one. And again, you can just see the local character of smaller regional celebrations. This one was in Zacatecas in northern Mexico. And the next one is the outgrowth of the revolution. So after independence, after the revolution, Mexican history is really rewritten by artists. And it's artists that you're familiar with: Diego Rivera, Jose Clemente Orozco, David Alfaro Siqueiros. And they're the Mexican muralists who paint Mexico's history. they reinvent it, as Enrique Krause talked about last month. He talked about the myth of this indigenous past that was wonderful, and then the Spaniards came in and wrecked everything. And then Independence, the center of their independence murals is always Miguel Hidalgo, because he represented somebody who reached out to the disaffected people. Most of these guys were heavily involved with the Communist Party as well, and so you can see why they would choose Hidalgo as their hero of independence. So on the right, you have Jose Clemente Orozco's 1939 mural, and just so you can see, that's a staircase at the bottom, and the little things in the left and the middle, those are actually plants that are like ficus plants that are 4 or 5 feet tall. So you can see how huge Hidalgo is in this mural as he presides over the skulls and bones of all the people who died in the wars of independence. In this mural by Jose Chavez Morado, which is painted in Guanajuato, where Hidalgo, his movement was centered. It's one of the first places that was captured by Hidalgo. You can see Hidalgo up on the right as the Christ-like figure. He's got the white behind him. He's saving the indigenous child there, while the rich people behind the column there are fleeing away from him. And then on the other side, the east side of that same staircase, is his head hanging in the cage after he was, his head was severed and hung at the plaza there. This mural, there's so many parts to it that we would have to have a slideshow of the entire thing to show all of it. But really, Hidalgo is a central figure in that movement. Sculptors like Francisco Zúñiga also created representations of the everyday heroes of independence. They're not just commemorating Hidalgo and Morelos. They're commemorating people like Andrés Quintana Roo, and for the first time, some women like Leona Vicario, who actually had a child in a cave as she was fleeing the Spanish army. And she is actually one of the people who helped write that Declaration of Sentiments. We'll move on to the next one. So after the revolution, as Deborah mentioned last time, the Revolution Day celebrations really take over as being a little more important than the Independence Day celebrations, except in the regional areas where Morelos and Guerrero and Hidalgo had been strong. And so you see this one is again from, this is from Oaxaca, and this was a Mexican Independence Day celebration in 1941. The other thing that's really important about this time period is that the Independence Day celebrations that did happen were very militaristic in character. They happened on the Zocalo. There were military parades. 20,000 troops in 1929 marched in the Capitol Parade, the biggest parade that had been held in 30 years. And President Portes Gil reviewed troops with the Minister of War. There was a commemoration service for the heroes at the Independence Monument. Airplanes, again, flew maneuvers in the formation overhead, but there was no pageantry or reenaction of history or celebration or mimicking of the Grito de Dolores. And that continued in 1935 and in 1941. In 1935, there were also 30,000 athletes from the Mexican Army that staged the greatest sport meeting in history at the Army Aviation Field, and thousands of officers and men engaged in horse and foot races, and there were aviation stunts again, cavalry, infantry maneuvers. But this also indicates, kind of reflects the character of Mexican politics at that time, which was dominated by the PRI and was all about institutionalizing the revolution across the country. So you don't see many gritos reenacted then. Okay, we'll go to the next one. In the 1950s and 60s, it becomes again marketed as a tourist event, and we start seeing reenactions of the Grito de Dolores again. And this ends in 1968 with parallel celebrations on September 15th in Mexico City. One at the Zocalo on the right bottom, where soldiers had to keep watch over the reenaction of the Grito de Dolores because the student protests were bubbling in Mexico. This is right before Mexico is about to host the Olympic Games. And on the left is the celebration that was a little bit like Woodstock at UNAM. And UNAM was where the students that would begin demonstrating in the Zocalo on the 18th of September, just 2 days after this festival ended at UNAM, they also issued their own grito with demands for democracy in Mexico. So President Diaz Ordaz gave the traditional Grito de Dolores, and Alberto Castillo at UNAM gave a fiery speech that encouraged students to protest against government corruption at UNAM. Right, we'll go to the next. So the other thing that you can see in the 20th century is how celebrations of Mexican independence have reflected the tenor of U.S.-Mexican relations. I mentioned in 1913 that U.S. soldiers tore down the Mexican flags at Brownsville and El Paso that were right on the other side of the border because they perceived that as being unpatriotic. But in 1979, when Jimmy Carter visited Mexico for a state visit, and then when Clinton visited, and also when President Obama visited, they've all visited the Mexican Independence Monument. That's one thing that Mexico and the United States have in common. Their visions of independence at the moments of their founding were relatively similar. So with all the other snafus that might be going on in U.S.-Mexican relationship, the one thing that they can agree on is that independence and independence from Europe was a good thing, and the founding of the nation. So this seems to be the place at which all the presidents make their visit. Another thing that happened in the 1940s, both in New York City and in Mexico City, was that the Inter-American Development Commission and the trade boards of Mexico and the United States tended to have luncheons on September 16th for exporters and importers to try to encourage business and trade. And in 1947, the Mexican ambassador who was hosting a luncheon in Washington, D.C., said, "Today we are honoring interdependence as well as independence." There was also the issuing of joint postage stamps in 1960 on the 150th anniversary of independence. Right, and I'm going to conclude then with a couple of slides of Mexican Americans in the United States celebrating Mexican independence. So the first one is 1920s celebrations, which involved in the United States the naming of beauty queens, which is interesting, something that was not a feature at all of Mexican independence celebrations in Mexico. And so really you could see a lot of desires to become more American by the Mexican American community. They were transformed from strictly Mexican nationalist celebrations, which extolled the virtues of Mexican nationalism, to bicultural events that expressed their newfound Mexican American identity. And of course, this wasn't without conflict, but it did occur from really the 1870s on, commemorations of Mexican Independence Day in the United States. The Spanish language press and its advertisers were big promoters of Mexican Independence Day holiday in the United States because they were selling lots of paraphernalia to help you celebrate your September 16th. And this kept nostalgia for Mexico alive. In 1923, La Buena Prensa from El Paso sponsored a poetry contest for Mexican Americans to write about their love for Mexico, and this was the winning poem, Patria, Patria Querida. Your children love you, though we are far from your warmth. We proclaim you on this day, terrestrial queen, mother of heroes and martyrs. Mixed messages appear with that poem, though, because opposite it, and I couldn't get a good image of this or else it would be up here, was an advertisement for skin lightening cream, crema blanqueadora, to make your skin more white. Now, being lighter skinned in Mexico has always been somewhat of an advantage, so it's not just something that was particularly American, but it's interesting to see those two things juxtaposed next to each other. By the 1930s, many of the newspapers began to include their articles in English as well, and these were as an attempt to Americanize the readers, to get them to be able to speak both English and Spanish. In 1926, one of the biggest celebrations I could find record of was held in northwest Indiana, close to Chicago. And the mayor led a parade of Mexican charros. These are the Mexican cowboys, and floats, which commemorated moments in Mexican history. It was very similar to this Grand Desfile that had been held at the Centennial. 2,500 people in northwest Indiana took place in this celebration. And the paper, the English language paper, covered it positively in an article that was entitled "Mexican Parade Takes City by Storm." It remarked that this pageant was as good as any festival ever held in the city. The Junta Patriotica coordinated the festivities, just as one had in Mexico. On September 15th, again, young Latino women participated in a beauty contest. That was a different one than this one, which was in Orange County, California. And there was a baseball tournament that was played. We'll move to the next one. You also see dances that were held, similar to the balls in Mexico, but these are populated with young teenagers, and the caption on this Russell Lee photograph said, "Dance at the Mexican Independence Day celebration. The younger Mexicans are thoroughly Americanized and have retained few of the Mexican customs." And the next image is also an interesting juxtaposition of the older Mexican-American immigrant community and then their children, who were American citizens, who were holding a festival in St. Paul, Minnesota. And you can see Hidalgo and Juarez. Next to Hidalgo on the other side of the flag is George Washington, and next to Juarez is Abraham Lincoln on the other side. And those two, Lincoln and Juarez, have often been compared to each other. And this one was more a civic celebration, but indicating that while Independence Day celebrations were kind of waning in Mexico, they were on the rise in the United States. And we'll move to the next one. Okay, so then we have Cinco de Mayo, which many Americans confuse with Mexican Independence Day. And Cinco de Mayo is celebrated more in the United States than it is in Mexico. And it became a holiday celebrated in the 1870s by Mexican immigrants to California. Then kind of fell out of favor, but by the 1960s, Cinco de Mayo was as important as Mexican Independence Day and probably more widely recognized in the United States as a holiday. And that's in part due to the food and beverage industry's big campaign. You're going to laugh at me, but it's really, you can see here, but also in 1985, Mexican Americans were threatening to boycott Coors beer because of alleged discrimination against Mexican American employees. And as part of the deal for Mexican Americans to not boycott Coors, Coors put aside a fund for the celebration of Mexican American civic holidays, and it was mostly dedicated towards Cinco de Mayo celebrations if the Mexican Americans would drop their plans for a boycott. This was in 1985, and you can definitely see that Cinco de Mayo celebrations have picked up. It's ironic, I think, that Cinco de Mayo is more recognized in the United States than in Mexico. It's kind of a minor bank holiday in Mexico, except in Puebla, where the actual battle took place. And the only reason it became a bigger holiday in Mexico is because May 1st is Labor Day, and May 5th would give you a nice long weekend if you took it. So May 5th gets celebrated there, but where it's celebrated in Puebla, it is a celebration of anti-imperialism. It's the Mexican army beat the French. They won the battle, they lost the war. That's when Maximilian comes to Mexico. But they won that first battle, and that's the day that Cinco de Mayo is celebrated on. So that's the meaning of that holiday. But really, the meaning in Mexico is an anti-imperialism holiday. So it's really rather ironic that that's the holiday that's celebrated here in the United States a little bit more. Okay, so this brings us up to the Bicentenario, which is, of course, this year. And of course, this year there was quite the pyrotechnic display and the issuing of the grito in Mexico City and cities all over Mexico. The saddest display was in Juarez, which is the city across from El Paso, Texas, that's been racked by drug-related violence, in which fewer than 30 people witnessed the grito after the mayor called off the celebration for fear that people might be targets of the drug-related violence there. On the other side of the border in El Paso, Texas, the Mexican consul there led a crowd of over 7,000 in El Paso to celebrate the Grito. So lastly, I'm going to leave you with this question of how we remember the past, and how what we say about our past and what we celebrate about our past shapes our present and our future. And this is still very much contested in Mexico. So when I was in Mexico in August, the bookstores were full of magazines that told you how you could celebrate the Bicentenario and celebrate your Dia 16 holiday. So on the left, this was a magazine for early childhood teachers. And this is a Miguel Hidalgo Gigante that you can make out of styrofoam balls and plastic garbage bags. And a reader's theater play that you could do with your students. Viva la Patria, Viva Mexico, Viva, Viva, Viva. You know, you do the whole thing. There was another section in this book, it was fantastic, where children were supposed to dress up as bells and sing a song of the bells, like the bells might have sung to Miguel Hidalgo if they would have sung. But on the right, you have Rios, who is a political cartoonist, and his discussion of Hidalgo, in which he complains that Hidalgo's history has been sanitized, that we talk about Hidalgo issuing a grito, but we don't talk about the fact that he wanted to abolish slavery, that he wanted to give everyone the vote, that he was interested in free thought and Enlightenment ideas, that we've kind of forgotten that part of his history and just made him into something that he really wasn't. So history is still contested today.